Continuing our study of the book of Judges. This morning, we're going to try to cover chapters 10 through 12, and the judges whose exploits are mentioned therein before we get to Samson after that.
You know, I've read a little ahead
Nothing wrong with that.
by Samson. You know, he was a mean man.
Samson? Yeah.
He was a mean man.
Yeah.
If you really just read it.
I call him a bully.
He was an interesting character. You got to wonder why he was listed among the judges, why God sent somebody and equipped somebody like Samson, but God was sure with him. But you know, there's all sorts of weird stuff going on with just about all these judges, you know.
Yeah.
You wonder why God chose them. And so there's a lesson in all of this. Before we plow into chapter 10, let's spend a couple of minutes. We finished rather quickly last time discussing Abimelech and his reign. And as we know, Abimelech represents Israel's first efforts to choose a king for themselves to rule over themselves. And as we saw and as we will see, that the choice that Israel made of a king turned out to be absolutely disastrous.
Rick, was that a region? Was that more just Shechem, or would you say that was the country of Israel voted for him? I mean,
well, you know, that Lon raised an interesting question, and you know, some of us, and I kind of resist too. We know that Saul was named as the first king of Israel, but we see that in the beginning of chapter 9, you're right, it's the people of Shechem who chose him to be the leader. But then if you go over and you look in chapter 9, verse 22, it says, and Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years. Okay? So it appears that he was more or less the king, or the chosen one of Israel for 3 years, and it resulted in what? Civil war and absolute destruction. And as we saw before, you know, one of the things we see in Abimelech, and particularly in the parable that we have that's pronounced by Jotham, is we see a warning about, of course, about Israel as they were choosing a king, but it's also a warning to us that we need to be very careful about whom we choose to be the king of our lives. And as we see in the case of Israel, when given a choice to choose your own king, people more often than not make a bad choice. And they certainly did with Abimelech. And so what we see here is that, you know, God gives us freedom of choice. But when we exercise that freedom of choice the wrong way, it winds up, you know, with disastrous consequences. The people of Israel were given a warning about Abimelech. When Abimelech goes and he's making the pitch to be the king, in chapter 9, verse 2, he says, remember, I am your flesh. And so there we have a very open and obvious warning that who is it who frequently, or what is it that frequently seeks to be the king of our lives? Our own flesh, our own desire. And as soon as we let our own flesh, you know, be the king of our lives, just prepare yourself for disaster. And Abimelech represents Satan working through the flesh. And we see how Abimelech wound up. Abimelech was elevated to power, if you will, by the people of Shechem. And at the end, what happens? The people of Shechem destroy him, and he destroys the people of Shechem. And it's very interesting at the end that what was it that brought an end to Abimelech?
a millstone or a stone.
That's right. An upper millstone was thrown by whom?
A woman.
By a woman. So it's again an example of the woman and what the woman does, crushing the head. And it's specific that it is the woman who crushes the head of Abimelech. Just like in the beginning God says that the seed of the woman will crush Satan's head. So it's a foreshadowing of what Christ would do. And so there we have it. And this wasn't just the end of the Civil War. It is pretty much the beginning of civil war, because we're going to see that Israel continues to go down the slippery slope. Okay, so let's pick up with chapter 10 and see where that takes us.
I believe it's still going on today.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. You know, because what we see in these accounts, in these chapters we're reading, it does represent history history as it occurred back then, but it also represents things that are universally true about human beings of all ages. And so all these things that we read were not only true about Israel then, it's true of Israel today, but it's also true of us, Gentiles
Well,
today.
it kind of, to me, he was chosen by the people.
What's that?
I said he was chosen by the people.
Right.
And then God chose one, and he turned out, it's just human nature when you get away from God.
That's right.
We had a governor chosen, and I heard people that voted for him the second or whatever time said they knew he was already a crook, so they was going to vote for him.
Yeah. Well, we laugh about that. We laugh about these elections, but every election, we're given a choice. What kind of a choice are we going to make for our king or our leader? And the choices are kind of there. You're going to choose an olive tree. You're going to choose a fig tree. You're going to choose a grapevine, or you're going to choose the bramble. How many elections have resulted in the bramble being the victor? Way too many. Way too many. And then what do? The bramble invites us, come to my shade. If you're really going to elect the bramble, come and take comfort in my shade. And so many people do. Yes, sir.
When did fake news start?
I have that right here. It's in Judges chapter 11, verse 13. I'm glad you brought up that. That's interesting because, that's one of the things that, and we're going to talk about CNN today.
The Pope said it started when Adam and Eve was on earth.
No, you're exactly right. It's actually Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Satan was the beginning of the fake news. You're right. I saw that article. It was interesting.
He's the deceiver and the liar. Yes, he is.
Yep, and he is the father of all fake news today. But we have some fake news. It is. And I was really surprised to see that myself, because there is such an outcry about fake news these days. But you know what?
Learn to come back.
Yep, there always is an ulterior motive in the fake news that comes out. It's like, Satan had a purpose in his fake news, just like we're going to read today in chapter 11 about fake news. So it's been around a long time. It's not just a new phenomenon. The only thing that's new is people are calling it what it is, fake news more than they ever have before, I think. Okay, chapter 10. Lon, would you start reading for us?
After the time of Abimelech, a man of Iscar named Tolar, son of Puah, son of Dudu, rose to save Israel. He lived in Shamar in the hill country of Ephraim.
Pause right there. So I've got Tola as judge number 7. We've got different counts, but we can go down. All right, read number 2 and 3. Keep going.
He led Israel 23 years. Then he died and was buried in Shamar. He was followed by Jair of Gilead, who led Israel 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. They controlled 30 towns in Gilead, which to this day are called Havar-Jar. Jar died. He was buried in Kamar.
All right, pause right there. So in 5 verses of chapter 10, we covered 2 judges, Tola, who I think is number 7, and Jair, number 8. All right, then we get into a revelation of what's going on in Israel at the time. Keep reading there, Lon.
Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtaroths and the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Amorites, and the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served him, he became angry with them. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Amorites.
All right, pause right there just a second. It is said by some that this chapter 10 verse 6 represents one of the lowest points in the lives of Israel, because not only does it say that they serve the Baals, which we've seen before, and the Ashtaroth, but then it goes on to say, and they serve the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines. And they totally forsook the Lord God, which means they were doing what? They were continuing to make bad choices, not only of a king, but also whom they would worship and whom they would serve. It was almost as if they went out of their way to avoid acknowledging Jehovah God and just looked around for whatever else they could possibly find to worship. Now, what in the world would possess a person or a nation to do that? And is that still going on today?
Was that all those people they brought along with them that they wasn't supposed to?
Well, the ones that they mentioned, some of them were indigenous people of Israel that they didn't kill off, but some of them were the Moabites and the Ammonites. They were in some outlying regions. So it's not only did they worship the gods of the indigenous people that they were supposed to wipe out, they went actually looking in foreign nations to worship the gods of the foreign nations.
Yeah. It's amazing that, you know, is it because it's nature gods and they feel they get more effect from that? And God wasn't talking to them perhaps? I don't know, but I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
they're not trusting God. They're looking for gods, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's right. I think they're more after following the lead of their flesh than their spirit. That's pretty obvious.
It was probably the worldly goods.
Exactly.
That they could see these other people prospering, and
Yeah.
some of them figured out that, well, we prosper if we would do this.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
like
isn't that
us.
today? Isn't that today?
That's,
Yeah,
that's
that's
the
what I'm
newest
saying.
diet fad, or, you know what I mean, we all looking for
Or the
fads and
stock
trends.
market,
That's
or
right.
whatever.
We're looking for the fastest, quickest way.
Yeah, like some of these gods are like the gods of the rainfall, okay? So they worship the god of the rainfall. If you had a farm, you wanted that rain to come, so you worship that god. Some of them were the gods of prosperity of your animal flock, okay? Some of them were prosperity in your field. Some of them were, gods that would bring you health and would make, your wife would be fertile if you worship this particular god. So yeah, they were looking for things that would benefit themselves, just very
I wonder if
fleshly pursuit.
if God Almighty was still one of the gods they honored. But I mean, like say, they believed in multiple gods, obviously, huh?
Well, for a time they did, but it says at the end of verse 6, thus they forsook the Lord and did not serve him at all. In other words, he wasn't one of many. They just forgot about God. Why? Because his commands were too tough on them, or they didn't like doing what he commanded. For example, they worshiped the God of the rainfall and the harvest, but when the harvest came,